The greatest rivalry in the history of sports could rematch in the college football playoff national championship game. After Michigan beat Ohio State in Columbus 45-23, I made a video a few days later arguing the case that if USC and or TCU lost, Ohio State would deserve to get into the college football playoff. Their resume was strong. They looked impressive in every one of their wins, minus Northwestern and Maryland. And I'd argue that Northwestern was due to the weather. Maryland was a look-ahead game, just like how Illinois was a look-ahead game for Michigan, who's now 13-0 and number 2 in the college football playoff, and how Georgia has had some games, like I think Georgia Tech, Missouri, Kentucky, were bored or were looking ahead for bigger opponents to come. And that Ohio State had a good resume, a great team. They were better than Alabama in every part of their resume, except for the fact that they had one blowout loss. But Alabama had 2 close losses, and their best win was against an 8-4 Texas. I thought that Ohio State was better than USC. And I still think they're actually better than TCU, and I have them as my 3rd best team in the country. Now, it makes sense why the committee put TCU ahead of Ohio State, because the committee claims to care about resume and strength of record more than brand, and strength of record would indicate that TCU is the better team. So I applaud them for putting TCU at the 3rd spot. But Ohio State made it. Ohio State was given a favorable chance to make the playoff, and people said, no, Caleb Williams would take care of business. USC would beat Utah because it's hard to beat a good team twice. Well, Kyle Whittingham just smoked a cigarette, drank a beer, tossed it, looked at you and said, "What are you smoking?" and destroyed USC after trailing by 14 points. Beat them 47-24. They injured Caleb Williams. They physically tossed around USC. And now Penn State and Utah are going to be matching up in the Rose Bowl. Michigan took care of business against Purdue. They had the same amount of red zone trips, but Michigan had 6 touchdowns, whereas Purdue had 5 field goals and 1 touchdown. Big difference there. Shows how good Michigan's defense is and how efficient Michigan's offense has become. Pretty consistent throughout the whole game. Obviously better in the second half. Michigan's 13-0 for the first time ever. They've had 13 wins in one season. Jim Harbaugh's won back-to-back Big Ten championships, and Ohio State's only loss is to that 13-0 Michigan team. So when you have one loss to a 13-0 team, and then you compare, let's just say Bama, who's had 2 losses to a 9-4 team and to a 10-2 team, or even TCU. They have 1 extra win. I don't think they should be penalized and kicked out of the playoff, and they weren't due to playing a conference title game, but they lost to a 10-3 Kansas State team, who is not nearly as good as Michigan football. I'm just happy. And I was laying out all that different information because I love information, I love statistics, and I also love the fact that everyone thought this wouldn't happen, and it did. Not a whole lot of people, except for Ohio State fans, wanted this to happen or thought it would happen. And I thought it was a great possibility, and I wanted it to happen because I'm a Michigan fan, and part of me doesn't want to face Ohio State again, but a greater part of me does. For the history of the rivalry, for the fact that I think my Michigan Wolverines could win again, possibly by double digits again. I genuinely believe Michigan is the better team overall. They have the better matchup against Ohio State. They're physically and mentally tougher than the Buckeyes. Why not have a second round? And if they beat us, then they've earned it. And Ryan Day will have proven himself to be the elite head coach that I still think he is, and that many of us thought he was entering this season. For the history of the game and for the Big Ten, and even for Michigan football, because now Michigan, they beat a college football playoff participant. It's good for everything. But that's just my opinion. You can disagree with my opinion because it's an opinion. But I'm very happy that this occurred. And there's a very real chance, an extremely real chance, that these teams, that they can meet in the national title. There's a very real chance of that happening. Ohio State, and we'll get into this a little later, let me tell you, Ohio State, they have a decent matchup against Georgia. They really do. And then Michigan versus TCU, Michigan being all around the more physical team, even more of a second half team than TCU is, and being more talented, Michigan is a favorable matchup against TCU. So for the Big Ten, for the game, for Michigan and Ohio State, this is amazing. And I think it's really cool that it happened, and it's really cool that it aligned to where these two didn't face off in the semifinal, but instead both of these teams have the opportunity to win their semifinal games and face off against each other for it all, for all of the marbles. Both of these teams have an impressive resume. Ohio State is supposedly more efficient. They're supposedly higher in FPI, but Michigan has caught up to them over the past 2 weeks. Ohio State by FPI is only ahead of Michigan by 0.8 points. And in efficiency, Michigan is only behind Ohio State in 0.5 points. So Michigan very well they're very close to Alabama and Ohio State in football power index and efficiency. The only team that's significantly ahead of them by more than 2 points in either of those categories is Georgia. In a Michigan-Georgia rematch, that's something that I would also be excited for. Of course, getting a chance to take revenge on a team that humiliated my Wolverines in the playoffs. Michigan's number 4 in FPI, number 4 in efficiency. OSU's number 2 in those categories, and there's a good reason why. Most of Ohio State's efficiency comes from their offense, which is ranked number 1 in the country in that area, and the only thing that holds them back from being number 1 overall is their defense and special teams, which are 15th and 72nd nationally. Michigan is number 4 in efficiency. They have the 7th most efficient offense, the 6th most efficient defense, which are actually more efficient in rankings ahead of Alabama's offense and defense. But Alabama barely edges Michigan because Alabama is 21st in special teams efficiency. Michigan is only 49th this year in special teams efficiency. So both of these teams, they utilize their talent well. Michigan's 14th in total team talent, Ohio State's 3rd. Both these offenses are schematically impressive. Even the defenses for both of these teams are schematically impressive. You can say that. Michigan's defense is better than Ohio State's defense. And for the offense, it's the opposite. Ohio State has, at least in theory, and by talent and points per game scored, the better offense. And both, on average, offense and defense are coordinated and schemed well. These are playoff teams. Michigan has the number 7 offense, scoring 40.1 points per game, and the number 5 scoring defense, allowing 13.4 points per game. Ohio State is the number 2 scoring offense, which scores 44.5 points per game, and the number 13th scoring defense, allowing 19.2. Tennessee has the number 1 scoring offense, but seeing how they, despite a good wide receiver core and a good QB room, failed to target Georgia's weakness, their secondary, they've struggled in some other games. Like against Pittsburgh, their offense wasn't always clicking. Against Florida, it's easy to score 40 points on Florida, and they didn't even hit 40 points. Tennessee's offense being sometimes consistent, sometimes not. Ohio State, despite not scoring as many points per game, is they're the much more consistent offense. They're an elite offense, that's for sure. Michigan, they have that elite defense. Their offense, I'd say with a healthy quorum and with how J.J. McCarthy's playing, I would say that offense is becoming borderline elite. Ohio State's defense is certainly great. The Wolverines have the number 2 strength of record. Ohio State is the number 4 strength of record. And both of these teams win by nearly 4 touchdowns per game on average. Michigan winning on average by 26.7 points per game. Ohio State winning by an average of 25.3 points per game. And this just speaks to the dominance of both teams. Both teams have dominated virtually all of their wins. Michigan didn't dominate against Illinois and against Maryland, and Ohio State didn't dominate against Northwestern or against Maryland as well, and against Notre Dame. But they've won most of their games by a substantial amount of points. Ohio State, for example, blowing out Arkansas State, blowing out Toledo, blowing out Wisconsin, Iowa, blowing out Rutgers, blowing out Michigan State. Michigan, they just destroyed UConn, Colorado State, destroyed Hawaii. They destroyed Rutgers. They handily beat Iowa in a game that was more dominant than the score indicated. And, Michigan's looked impressive as well throughout the whole year. Same with Ohio State. So these two teams, by resume, they're top 4 in strength of record. They're top 4 in efficiency and football power. Both of them have top 7 offenses. Both have top 13 defenses. In just points per game, Michigan has, they have a borderline elite offense and defense. Ohio State has a borderline elite offense and a defense that, outside of that one game against Michigan, looked elite. So a defense that certainly has that elite potential as well. Both of these teams are more than deserving of a playoff spot. But that's statistics. These are just things that, in theory, justify their placement here. Their goals and how they achieve those goals are what is going to ultimately determine whether they did deserve that spot or not. Because if Alabama goes out, blows out an opponent in their bowl game, and Ohio State gets destroyed by Georgia, there could be a conversation at the end of the year that maybe Alabama was the better team, or maybe Tennessee was even better than Ohio State. And for Michigan, if TCU beats Michigan, then TCU at the end of the year, you know what? TCU would be the better team. So these rankings, they're not finalized yet because it's not the end of the year yet. Most teams in the nation, or all of them that have 500 records or higher, still have a game, or in the case of Ohio State and Michigan, potentially 2 more games to prove themselves and to vie for the highest possible ranking they can achieve. For Michigan, they'll have to adjust their scheme to Max Duggan's dual threat abilities. Max Duggan, I will tell you something. Max Duggan deserves the Heisman Trophy. He carried his team on his back versus Kansas State. Kansas State now, of course, being, I don't exactly know what they're ranked in the college football playoff. I didn't watch that whole ordeal, but ranked pretty highly for a good reason. Kansas State 10-3, they're 7-2. They're number 9. Yeah, number 9, which is a pretty high ranking, of course. TCU still being the 3rd best team in the country. I think Kansas State is the 5th best team in the country in my own top 25. Anyway, Max Duggan, 15 carries, 110 yards, and 1 rushing touchdown. On the ground, he was 18 of 36 for 251 yards, a touchdown and a pick against a Kansas State defense that has been top 10, top 15, top 20 in efficiency for most of the year. Kansas State is a solid team in the trenches and on defense, and with Will Howard at quarterback, they do have that explosive capability. TCU didn't show up against Kansas State outside of Max Duggan. There were drops from the wide receivers. The play calling was meh. I don't know what Garrett Riley was doing running from the shotgun when you have a physical quarterback like Duggan, who you could probably sneak into the end zone on that 4th and goal. But it is what it is. Garrett Riley is overall still a good play caller. Michigan hasn't faced a quarterback like Duggan. Duggan does not have Stroud's arm, but he has infinitely more mobility, or at least is willing to be more mobile than CJ Stroud is. They have not faced a dual threat quarterback of his level since, honestly, Stetson Bennett last year. That would be the closest comparison to Max Duggan that they have faced in recent memory, would be Stetson Bennett from last year. And he killed us. We couldn't sack him. His deep ball was accurate. always was hitting guys on target. Michigan's going to have to adjust their scheme to his dual threat capabilities. I think that Edwards and Mullings will be able to ground and pound TCU behind the Wolverines' elite O-line. I would expect Michigan very early as a prediction to score a lot of points on this TCU defense. The question is, can Michigan's defense hold up against a TCU offense that Michigan hasn't faced an offense quite like this? Yes, they're not at Ohio State's level, but I do actually like the matchup better just because of Duggan's dual threat capability and the fact that, listen, Ohio State didn't target Michigan a whole lot deep. And part of that was because our secondary is good, but I think TCU, just from a play calling standpoint, is going to be more aggressive and more gutsy in trying to beat Michigan deep. And with Duggan's dual threat capability, Michigan will just have to be prepared. If Michigan wins, McCarthy will have to play his A-plus game again versus Georgia or Ohio State, who both have better defenses than TCU. Both of them. And I would say both of them have better offenses than TCU does. TCU, if we're being honest, despite not being ranked in the 4th seed, they are the worst team in the playoffs. I'm completely confident in saying that. They have the lowest floor. Maybe not. There might be an argument that Ohio State has the lowest floor just from a mental and physical toughness standpoint, but TCU's ceiling is certainly capped at a much lower level than Michigan, Ohio State, or Georgia. McCarthy is going to have to be relied on more in Michigan's national title appearance if they do beat TCU. I think Michigan can beat TCU with just their run game and getting away with McCarthy having a mediocre or just above average game. They can't do that. They cannot do that when they face Ohio State or Georgia. He's going to have to be on his A-plus game if they beat TCU, and he should be on his A-plus game in the TCU or the national title game if they do make it to the national title. I'm just talking from a matchup standpoint. Michigan will be able to run the type of game more comfortably that they want to run against a team like TCU compared to Georgia or Ohio State. Let's talk about the Buckeyes here. Ohio State, they face Georgia. They have a much tougher matchup to start off than Michigan does. But here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is the case of Georgia. They held Tennessee to 3 points, to 13 points. And really, they held them to 6 points until a garbage time touchdown. But Garrett Nussmeier and Malik Neighbors were able to tear up their secondary like it was nothing. Georgia's secondary, for the whole game, did their best impersonation of 2021 Michigan State. It was not good. Keely Ringo did not look good at corner. None of their safeties or corners looked good. I mean, Neighbors, Booty, they were open. And broken tackles were made and incorrect plays were made by that Georgia secondary. And LSU doesn't have an O-line. They don't have a C.J. Stroud at quarterback. Ohio State's offense is better at every position compared to LSU, and LSU was able to hang 30 points. Georgia struggled with this last year too. When Georgia faces a good O-line, a great quarterback, and great wide receivers, you will score points on them. You will. The reason they were able to beat Tennessee is they schemed it well, Georgia played their perfect game, and Tennessee's offensive line is improved. It's good, but it's not great. It's not elite. It doesn't have the same talent level, the same ceiling, the same potential power that an Ohio State or Alabama O-line will. And Alabama last year was just able to engage in a shootout, play the game they wanted, and Stetson Bennett, I don't know if he can engage in a shootout where his defense is just completely helpless. He couldn't do it last year, and because of the injury to Jamison Williams and Georgia's scheming better the second time around, he didn't have to engage in a shootout in the national title. But can Ohio State make Georgia play in a high-paced, no-huddle offensive game and start fast and repeatedly abuse that secondary? Because Ohio State's the type of team, and their defense can force turnovers too. It's a much improved defense compared to last year's unit. If they can force Georgia to punt, once or twice, and if LSU can force Georgia to punt twice, I'm confident Ohio State can force Georgia to punt 3 or 4 times. And then Ohio State, through explosive plays, repeatedly punches Georgia in the mouth, and let's just say they get a quick head start, and they're up 14-0 to begin the game. Well, Georgia's already in an uncomfortable position because no team went up quickly by 2 touchdowns against Georgia. That already puts them in an uncomfortable position and it'll make them do things they don't want to do. Against an Ohio State defense that is good at linebacker, it's okay to good at safety, and is good at D-line. Their one weakness is corner. That's Ohio State's weakness. And Georgia's strength is tight ends. Their wide receivers with McConkey are good, but they're not at Ohio State's level. Ohio State does have a good, underrated matchup against Georgia, despite Georgia, in my opinion, being the obviously better team and the more physically tough team. They don't have the same matchups against Ohio State that, let's say, Michigan does, because I think Michigan has the better secondary, and they have that bend but don't break defense that is more suited to take care of Ohio State's offense. Georgia's better at the front 7, and the problem with that is Ohio State's comfortable not running the football and just passing on you. So watch out for that, in the same way that if you're watching that Michigan TCU game, watch out for Max Duggan to probably exploit Michigan's defense, because Michigan, with Chubba Purdy in that Nebraska game, for example, they couldn't stop him when he ran it. And Duggan, they haven't faced a dual threat quarterback like him or a quarterback like him all season long. I think Eichenberg and Chambers, they'll have to plug holes in that Georgia O-line if Ohio State wants to win. And I do think that they will do a better job at stopping the run than they did against Michigan, because Kendall Milton, Dejon Edwards, and Kenny McIntosh, they're not Donovan Edwards or Blake Corum. They are not the same players that Michigan has at running back. They don't have the same explosiveness, the same top-end speed. They might have a better power ability than Edwards, but they don't have the same receiving ability. They're just not as good as Corum or Edwards. So Ohio State can play that. They can sell out against the run, and Georgia's not going to break a 75-yard run against them. Now, it could still hurt. They could get 20 to 25 to 30 yards, but you're not going to have that same risk factor if you sell out against the run against Georgia. And I think that, Ohio State can use that game plan they did against Michigan and perform it more effectively against Georgia, just because the threat of the run isn't there as much. And I think that Ohio State with Eichenberg and Chambers will certainly do that, and it will create challenges. It'll create challenges for Georgia's run game and Georgia's offense as a whole. But if we're being honest here, Ohio State is the much tougher matchup. They're not going to be favorites by any means, while Michigan will be favored to beat TCU. The national championship game is going to be favored to beat Georgia versus Michigan. The next favorite would be Ohio State versus Michigan. I mean, TCU is the lowest shot of all of these teams to win it all, and to let alone make it to the national title game. If Ohio State wins, it's less important about, preparing differently, because they've already faced supposedly the toughest team in the nation, and if they beat them, then they can beat anyone. Meanwhile, for Michigan, they face TCU. They can afford to game plan differently against TCU and, save their passing game, save McCarthy. They're not, I don't think they'll have to perform at that A+ level in the passing department to beat TCU. They will have to against Georgia or Ohio State. If Ohio State wins, we know that they'll have the potential to beat Michigan. We know that they'll have the game plan to beat Michigan if they beat Georgia, because that's how good Georgia is. But they'll have to maintain their cool, because Ohio State, as that Michigan game has shown, when times get tough, when the plan doesn't execute the way that you wanted it to execute, when things don't go to plan, Ohio State melts down. And if that happens, in the Georgia game, they won't win. My best bet, for Ohio State winning that Georgia game is they get ahead by double digits and never look back. I think if it's a close game for the majority of the game, Georgia would eventually wear down Ohio State and beat them. But Ohio State has that offense to get up by 10 points or 14 points and just never look back and never have to be in that uncomfortable, close, physical game. If they want to, beat Michigan or TCU, they'd have to repeat that performance again, which would be unlikely, or they'd have to maintain their cool and be willing to play in that close game, play in being uncomfortable, and still come out with a win. Because that's what not just elite teams do. There are some elite teams that don't do that, but that's what teams that win the national title and teams that can be dynasties do. And that's what Ohio State fans and Ryan Day want. They want a dynasty. They want a team that is elite and can win national championships. So I think the likelihood that these two teams meet in the national championship game, it's not the favorite matchup. That's going to be Georgia and Michigan, but it's very likely we can have that matchup. I'm excited for whether Michigan faces Ohio State or Georgia in the national title. Yes, I think we beat TCU at this very moment, but a prediction video won't come for the next few weeks. But I'm excited for Michigan's game against TCU, most importantly, because nothing's guaranteed, and I can't wait to see my team play in the national title game for the second year in a row. And for Ohio State, you've earned your way because other teams failed. And some would say, well, other teams fail and it's not fair, but you did your job. You won 11 games, only lost one. Other teams lost more than you. That's doing your job. You were rewarded for succeeding in the regular season in all but one game. So congratulations to both of these teams. I can't wait to see how they play in the college football playoff. And that's all I have to say for this video. If you liked it, please make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys around. Bye-bye.